In 1923, excavators working in the temple complex at Shurapak, modern Tel Farah, uncovered a cache of clay tablets sealed beneath a collapsed mud brick wall. The tablets were catalogued, photographed, and shipped to Berlin. For decades, they remained untranslated, filed among thousands of other administrative documents from the mid-3rd millennium. When epigraphers finally examined them in detail in 1964, they discovered something unexpected. The tablets were lexical lists, vocabulary lists used to train scribes. They contained columns of Sumerian words arranged by category, types of officials, units of measurement, agricultural terms, names of tools. But these were not elementary lessons. The lists were comprehensive, technical, and systematic. They catalogued an administrative apparatus already complete. Terms for grain inspectors, canal supervisors, warehouse overseers, ceremonial barge pilots, redistribution officers. Positions implying layers of infrastructure, hierarchy, and legal definition. The tablets themselves were teaching tools, but the system they taught was not being explained. It was being memorized. The scribes were learning words for institutions that already existed in fully operational form. No tablet in the archive describes how these offices were created, what problems they were designed to solve, or who first defined their functions. The lexicon was inheritance, not invention. This absence appears across southern Mesopotamia in the earliest strata of literate urban life. The first tablets do not record the establishment of systems, they record the use of systems already understood. At Uruk, the earliest pictographic tablets assume the existence of complex rationing schedules, labor rotation protocols, and commodity distribution networks. The signs are crude, the writing rudimentary, but the concepts behind them are not. The signs represent words for things that already had names. At Jemdet Nasa, at Ur, at Lagash, the pattern repeats. The administrative language appears suddenly, not experimentally. The scribes are not inventing the terms as they go. They are recording procedures and titles inherited from something prior. The lexical lists were updated over centuries. New words were added, old ones annotated, categories expanded. But the structure remained the same. A vast inherited catalogue of institutional terms taught to each new generation of scribes. When Sumerian scribes in the city of Nippur copied lexical texts in the early 2nd millennium, they were still using lists that originated 1,000 years earlier. The continuity was deliberate. Knowledge was not discovered, it was transmitted. The education of scribes did not begin with observation of the world and the gradual naming of things. It began with the memorization of names already given. At Tel Abu Salabik, tablets dated to around 2500 BCE include entries for officials whose titles are grammatically archaic even in context. The words are Old Sumerian, older than the dialect used in the surrounding text. They are fossilized terms preserved within a living document. The scribes were copying vocabulary that predated their own linguistic period. They did not simplify or update the terms, they transmitted them as received. The language itself became a form of memory. Words carried within them the shape of older institutions, older hierarchies, older modes of organization. The scribes did not ask where the words came from. They learned them because they were necessary. The institutions named by those words were still functioning. In the city of Gersu, a collection of tablets from the archive of the Ami, the temple of the goddess Nansha, contains records spanning 3 generations of scribes. The handwriting changes, the names of overseers change, but the vocabulary remains identical. Generation after generation, scribes used the same terms for canal inspector, barley distributor, textile warehouse supervisor, sacrificial lamb coordinator. The continuity was not coincidental, it was institutional. The system was designed to reproduce itself through scribal training, and the lexical lists were the mechanism of that reproduction. Knowledge was not created by individuals, it was inherited by institutions. But the earliest lexical lists contain no prologues, no explanations of origin. There are no tablets that say, in the time of King X, the office of grain inspector was created to solve the problem of Y. The titles appear as facts. The system is treated as given. Even the oldest lists assume that their content is already known, at least in practice. The scribe learning the word for redistribution officer is learning the name for something he has already seen. The lexicon does not bring the institution into being. It formalizes what already exists. But if the institution already exists, when did it begin? There are no Sumerian tablets that describe the invention of bureaucracy. There are thousands that describe its operation. The earliest cities of southern Mesopotamia functioned with administrative complexity that required not only the existence of many specialized roles, but a shared understanding of how those roles related to one another. The lexical lists catalogue that understanding. They do not explain it. Scribes learned what an adrig was, what a sagi did, what a karushta managed. They did not learn why those offices existed or who first conceived of them. The lists were tools of continuity, not pedagogy. They preserved the names of systems that had already been running long enough to require formalized transmission. Lexical texts continued to be copied for nearly 2,000 years. Even as Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language, scribes in Babylon and Assyria still learned the old Sumerian terms for temple administrators, field measurers, livestock accountants. The words outlived the cities they described. They became fixed points of reference, anchors in a long tradition of institutional memory. But the beginning of that tradition is not recorded. The first scribes were not writing the origin of the system, they were already writing within it. The tablets from Shuruppak remain in Berlin, catalogued and translated. The lexical lists are now readable. The terms have been glossed, the categories identified. But the question embedded in their structure remains unanswered. These are teaching texts. They train scribes in the language of governance. But they do not say who first created the governance they name. They preserve words without origin stories. They transmit roles without founders. The system exists because it was already there when writing began. And if it was already there, what came before the names were written? The Sumerian king list exists in multiple copies, most of them dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, though the content they record reaches back 1,000 years earlier. The most complete version, catalogued as the Weld Blundell Prism and housed in the Ashmolean Museum, was acquired in 1922 from a dealer in Baghdad. It is a small clay object, four-sided, covered in cuneiform script, and it contains one of the most puzzling documents in ancient Near Eastern literature. The text begins with a formulaic statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not established, not created, not awarded, descended. The verb is namlugal ba'abe. Kingship came down, already complete. The text does not say from where it descended or why it chose Eridu. It simply states that before any named king ruled, kingship as an institution already existed and was transferred to the first city. The list then proceeds through a sequence of antediluvian kings, rulers said to have reigned before the Great Flood. These kings are assigned reigns of implausible length: 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. Scholars have long interpreted these figures as mythical or symbolic. But what is often overlooked is not the length of the reigns, but the consistency of the structure. Each king is listed with a name, a city, and a reign length. The format is identical to the historical kings listed later. There is no literary distinction made between the pre-flood kings and the post-flood rulers. The scribe treats them as part of the same continuous record. The only break is the flood itself, after which the text states, "The flood swept over." After the flood had swept over, when the kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The repetition of the phrase is exact. Kingship does not begin again, it is lowered again. The institution returns as it arrived, fully formed, already defined. This pattern appears across multiple copies of the king list. Whether inscribed in the Old Babylonian period or referenced in later Neo-Assyrian chronicles, the language remains the same. Kingship is never described as a human invention. It is not developed through trial and experience. It does not emerge from tribal leadership or military dominance. It descends. The term carries theological weight, but it also carries administrative precision. Kingship in Sumerian culture was not simply the authority of a ruler. It was a bundle of roles, responsibilities, rituals, and legal prerogatives. To say that it descended is to say that the entire apparatus arrived intact. The king does not define what kingship is. He inherits a role that pre-exists him. In another tablet from Nippur, dated to the Ur-3 period, a hymn to King Shulgi describes him as the one to whom kingship was given from the foundation of the city, from distant days. The phrase, "from the foundation," is Igi Kur She, implying temporal priority beyond living memory. Shulgi, a historical figure who ruled around 2094-2047 BCE, is described as receiving something that existed from distant days. The institution is older than the man. It is older than his dynasty. It is anchored in a past that the text does not attempt to specify. The language treats kingship as inheritance rather than achievement. Even a king as powerful and self-promoting as Shulgi does not claim to have redefined the office. He claims to have fulfilled it. The king list also includes a recurring formula after periods of political collapse or foreign invasion. The kingship was taken to City X. Not transferred by conquest, not seized by force, taken. The passive construction leaves the agent unstated. After the fall of the dynasty of Akkad, the text says, "The kingship was taken to Uruk." After the Gutian interregnum, the kingship was taken to Ur. The list treats kingship as an object that moves between cities but does not change in nature. It is not redefined by each new dynasty. It is occupied by them. The continuity is institutional, not personal. Kings die, cities fall, dynasties end, but kingship as a concept persists. It is treated as external to the individuals who hold it. There are no Sumerian texts that describe the creation of kingship. There are no origin myths in which gods deliberate and establish monarchy as a solution to human disorder. The closest parallel is found in the Sumerian composition known as the Instructions of Shuruppak, one of the oldest pieces of wisdom literature, which advises, "Serve the king, and he will give you his favour." But it does not explain why there is a king to serve, or who decided that kingship should exist. The institution is assumed. By the time the text was written, kingship was already so embedded in the social order that its origin was either forgotten or unnecessary to mention. Even in royal inscriptions that catalogue the achievements of individual kings, building projects, military victories, legal reforms, there is no claim of inventing the office itself. Kings describe themselves as restoring temples that had fallen into ruin, re-excavating canals that had silted over, renewing festivals that had been interrupted. The language is one of renewal, not innovation. The king's legitimacy derives from his ability to maintain continuity with what came before. To be a good king is to preserve what was given, not to create what is new. The Weld-Blundell prism lists over 100 kings spanning more than 2,000 years of recorded history, but the first line remains its most conceptually significant. After the kingship descended from heaven. The text does not ask from where it descended or what heaven signifies in this context. It states the descent as historical fact and moves on. The scribes who copied the list century after century did not question the statement. They transmitted it. The king list was not myth in the sense of imaginative storytelling. It was memory in the sense of institutional record. It preserved a claim about the origin of governance that the Sumerians themselves treated as knowledge. But if kingship descended already formed, what existed before it descended that made descent necessary? In 1946, archaeologists working at Eridu, ancient Mesopotamia's southernmost city, excavated below the foundations of the temple known as the E Engur, the house of the god Enki. Beneath the monumental platform of the later structure, they uncovered a sequence of 17 earlier temples, each built directly on the ruins of the one before. The lowest level, designated Temple 1, was a simple single-room shrine measuring roughly 12 by 15 feet, constructed on clean sand. It was the earliest religious structure found in Mesopotamia. Radiocarbon dating and ceramic typology placed it in the mid-6th millennium BCE, centuries before the invention of writing. The shrine was modest, but it was not accidental. It was oriented along the same axis as every temple built above it for the next 3,000 years. Each successive temple grew larger, more complex, more architecturally sophisticated. But every one maintained the original alignment. The continuity was deliberate. Whoever built Temple 7 in 4500 BCE and whoever built Temple 16 in 2500 BCE were preserving the orientation established by the builders of Temple 1. The relationship between the structures was not one of innovation, but of replication. The city of Eridu grew outward from that first shrine, and as it grew, the shrine was rebuilt again and again on the same sacred ground, always aligned the same way. The sequence at Eridu is not unique. At Uruk, excavations revealed similar layering beneath the Iana precinct, the sacred district dedicated to the goddess Inanna. The earliest monumental buildings there date to the late 4th millennium, but beneath them are older structures, smaller but architecturally deliberate. These early buildings were not experimental. They followed geometric planning. Walls met at right angles, rooms were proportioned, doorways were centered. Even in the deepest levels, where construction was relatively simple, the design was intentional. The builders were not figuring out how to create urban space. They were executing a plan. By the time Uruk reached its peak in the Uruk IV period, around 3200 BCE, the city covered more than 200 hectares and included the White Temple, the Limestone Temple, and a complex network of administrative buildings, storage facilities, and residential districts. The city's layout was not the result of incremental sprawl. It was structured. Streets ran in coordinated directions. Public buildings were clustered. The city had a center. Urban planning implies prior conceptualization. To organize space at the scale visible at Uruk and Eridu requires a model, either copied from an earlier example or derived from a shared design principle. But the earliest urban centers in southern Mesopotamia appear suddenly in the archaeological record. There are no intermediate stages between scattered agricultural settlements and dense, organized cities. The transition is abrupt. During the Ubaid period, from roughly 5500 to 4000 BCE, settlements in the southern alluvial plain were small, dispersed, and agrarian. During the subsequent Uruk period, from roughly 4000 to 3100 BCE, cities emerged, large, dense, differentiated, and architecturally sophisticated. The shift occurred within a few centuries, and it occurred across multiple sites simultaneously. Eridu, Uruk, Ur, and Nippur all grew into cities during the same general period, and they all exhibit similar patterns of centralized planning. They were not copies of one another in detail, but they shared an underlying logic. Public architecture was monumental. Residential zones were distinct. Sacred precincts were elevated. The cities were different expressions of a common idea. There are no Sumerian texts that describe the planning of cities. There are no inscriptions that say, "In this year, we laid out the streets in this manner for this reason." By the time writing appears in southern Mesopotamia, cities are already built. The earliest written tablets from Uruk, dated to around 3200 BCE, are administrative documents recording the flow of goods in and out of temple storehouses. The texts assume the existence of the city. They describe activity within it, but not the city's creation. The scribes recorded barley rations for workers, lists of livestock, inventories of pottery and textiles. These documents show that Uruk was functioning as an economic and administrative hub, but they do not explain how it came to be organized that way. The city already existed when the records began. The administrative texts describe a system in motion, not a system being designed. Even the earliest temples show architectural knowledge that seems fully developed. At Eridu, Temple 7, dated to approximately 4500 BCE, included a central hall flanked by two smaller chambers, an altar niche at one end and an offering table at the other. This tripartite layout became standard in Mesopotamian sacred architecture for millennia. The design was not unique to Eridu. It appears at other sites in similar periods. Temples at Tepe Gawra in the north and Tel Uqair in central Mesopotamia exhibit the same basic plan. The pattern suggests either direct influence or shared tradition. But if shared, where did the tradition originate? The tripartite temple appears in the archaeological record without precedent. There are no earlier versions that show the layout being tested or refined. It appears as a complete design and is then repeated. Royal inscriptions from later periods describe kings rebuilding temples on the old foundation, or according to the original plan. King Ur-Nammu of Ur, around 2100 BCE, inscribed bricks used in the reconstruction of the ziggurat at Ur, with the statement that he restored the structure to its ancient form. The phrase ancient form is Jish-hur an-Tajal, the plan that exists from above. The language implies that the temple's form was not invented by Ur-Nammu or his architects. It was inherited. The king's duty was to preserve the form, not to alter it. Even monumental rebuilding projects were acts of restoration rather than creation. Kings did not claim credit for designing the temples they built. They claimed credit for restoring what had been allowed to decay. At Nippur, the sacred city considered the religious center of Sumer, excavations uncovered the Ekur, the temple of Enlil, built and rebuilt over thousands of years. The earliest identifiable phase of the Ekur dates to the early dynastic period, around 2900 BCE, but beneath it are older structures whose function is unclear. They are not domestic buildings. They are not storage facilities. They are oriented according to the same axis as the later temple. The continuity is architectural. The later builders did not choose a new site. They built on top of what was already sacred. The sanctity of the place preceded the monumental temple. The temple formalized what was already recognized. In none of these cities is there evidence of trial and error urbanism. There are no false starts, no abandoned experimental districts, no evidence of planners learning through failure. The cities appear as coherent entities from their earliest identifiable phases. This does not mean they were perfect or unchanging. They were continuously modified, expanded, and rebuilt. But the modifications followed established logic. They did not create new logic. The urban form was inherited before it was written down. By the time the scribes began cataloguing the activities of the city itself was already the framework within which those activities occurred. It was the context, not the subject. The archaeological record shows continuity without documenting origin. The temples were rebuilt on ancient foundations. The cities were organized around inherited plans. But the texts do not say where the plans came from. They do not name the first architect, or the first lawgiver, or the first urban planner. The Sumerians built cities that assumed prior knowledge of how cities should be built. And if the knowledge was prior, what examples did they follow? In 1929, Leonard Woolley's excavation team at Ur reached a layer of sediment 11 feet thick, composed of clean, water-laid clay. The layer was sterile, no artifacts, no potsherds, no ash, no bones. Beneath it was a stratum containing painted pottery, stone tools, and mud brick structures consistent with late Ubaid settlement. Above it was a layer containing early dynastic artifacts and evidence of renewed urban occupation. Woolley interpreted the clay deposit as evidence of a catastrophic flood, a geological marker that seemed to correspond to the Sumerian accounts of the Great Deluge described in myth. The discovery made international headlines. Newspapers claimed that the biblical flood had been confirmed by science. But what Woolley had actually found was more ambiguous. The clay layer was localized. Subsequent excavations at other sites in southern Mesopotamia found no equivalent stratum at the same chronological level. At Eridu, a flood deposit was identified, but it dated to a different period. At Uruk, no such layer appeared. At Lagash, there was evidence of flooding, but it was shallow and intermittent. The deposits were real, but they were not uniform. There had been flooding, southern Mesopotamia was a floodplain, and catastrophic inundation was not rare. But there was no single event that left a consistent marker across the region. What the flood layers do show is interruption. At Ur, occupation ceased for a period after the deposition of the clay. The settlement was abandoned or drastically reduced. Then it resumed. The pottery styles changed, the architecture evolved, but the site itself was reoccupied. The continuity was spatial, not material. People returned to the same place, but they were not necessarily the same people. At Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, flood deposits appear in multiple phases, each separating periods of occupation. The city was inundated, rebuilt, inundated again, rebuilt again. The pattern was cyclical. Flooding was part of the environmental reality of southern Mesopotamia, not a singular apocalypse. But the texts treat the flood as singular. The Sumerian king list divides history into two eras, before the flood and after the flood. The flood is treated as absolute, a boundary that separates what came before from what came after. In the Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest Sumerian flood narratives, the flood is described not as divine punishment for human sin, but as a decision to destroy the seed of mankind. The text is fragmentary, but what survives describes the god Enki intervening to warn the king Ziusudra, who builds a boat and survives. After the flood, kingship is restored. The gods repopulate the earth. But the narrative does not describe what was lost. It does not catalogue knowledge, cities, or institutions that disappeared. The flood is acknowledged as total, but recovery is described as immediate. The text moves from destruction to restoration without detailing the process. The silence is structural. The narrative assumes that survival implies continuity, that what came after the flood was the same in kind as what came before, even if it was different in scale. The archaeological evidence does not show total destruction. It shows local flooding followed by reoccupation. Settlements rebuilt on the same sites after inundation retain some material continuity. Pottery forms evolved but did not disappear. Architectural styles shifted but did not start over from zero. If knowledge was lost, it was not lost completely. If systems collapsed, they were reconstructed. But the texts do not explain how. The Sumerian king list says that after the flood, the kingship was lowered from heaven again, but it does not describe the mechanism of restoration. The institution returns, but the process of return is left unnarrated. The scribes record the fact without explaining the method. At Kish, a city listed in the king list as the seat of the first post-flood dynasty, excavations revealed early dynastic occupation beginning around 2900 BCE. Beneath that were older strata, including flood deposits mixed with ash and debris. The flood at Kish was not clean. It was violent, associated with burning and structural collapse. Yet above it, the city was rebuilt. Temples were re-established, administrative buildings reappeared. The city resumed its role as a political and religious centre. The continuity suggests that whoever rebuilt Kish knew what a city was supposed to look like. They did not reinvent urbanism, they restored it. But if they restored it, they must have remembered it. And if they remembered it, what preserved that memory across the interruption of the flood? There are no Sumerian texts that describe the preservation of knowledge through the flood. The Eridu Genesis names Ziusudra as the survivor, but it does not say that he carried tablets with him or that he taught scribes after the waters receded. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a later Akkadian text that incorporates Sumerian flood traditions, describes Utnapishtim preserving life, but not explicitly preserving culture. The survival is biological, not institutional. Yet the institutions reappear. After the flood, there are kings again. There are cities again. There are temples again. The Sumerian texts do not explain how these things returned. They simply record that they did. The flood layers in the archaeological record are not apocalyptic. They are disruptive. They separate periods of occupation, but they do not erase continuity entirely. At some sites, pottery continues across the flood layer with only gradual stylistic change. At others, there is a gap, a hiatus, and then a resumption that looks different but not unrelated. The evidence is ambiguous. It suggests interruption, not annihilation. But the texts treat the flood as absolute. The discrepancy between the material record and the literary memory is unresolved. If the flood was local, why is it remembered as universal? If it was universal, why does the archaeological record not reflect total collapse? The gap between geology and narrative remains. What the texts preserve is not the flood itself, but the idea of the flood, an event that marks a division in time. Before the flood, there were cities, kings, and knowledge. After the flood, there were cities, kings, and knowledge. The flood interrupted, but did not erase. The institutions returned because something carried them across the break, but the texts do not say what that something was. Tablet BM 106445, housed in the British Museum, was excavated from Sippar in the late 19th century. It is dated to the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, but the content it records is administrative, a list of grain disbursements to temple workers. The text begins mid-procedure. There is no opening formula, no identification of the institution issuing the grain, no explanation of the calendar system used to date the transactions. The first line reads, Month 3, Day 12, barley, 6 gur, to the overseer of the weaving house. The tablet assumes the reader already knows which weaving house, which overseer, and which institution's calendar is being referenced. It does not explain the gur as a unit. It uses it as a given. The scribe is not introducing a system. He is operating within one. The tablet is one entry in a larger archive, part of a continuous record-keeping practice that was already standardized when this particular tablet was written. This pattern is not unique. Administrative tablets across southern Mesopotamia exhibit the same characteristic. They begin mid-sentence, structurally speaking. They reference roles without defining them, laws without stating them, procedures without explaining them. At Lagash, tablets from the archive of the city's Ensi, its governor, record payments to canal workers, distributions of beer rations to labourers, and inventories of bronze tools issued to smiths. The tablets list quantities, names, and dates, but they do not describe the legal framework that authorises the payments or the regulations that govern the rations. The system is assumed. A tablet from Gersu records the transfer of 300 sheep from one official to another. It names both officials by title, Shabra and Nubanda, but it does not define the hierarchy that relates them or the protocol that permits the transfer. The scribe expects the reader to already understand the structure within which both officials function. The earliest written documents from Mesopotamia, the proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk, dated to around 3200 BCE, are even more schematic. They are not narrative texts, they are lists. Lists of animals, lists of goods, lists of workers. The signs are pictographic, rudimentary, and often ambiguous. But the categories they represent are not ambiguous. There are signs for different kinds of labourers, permanent workers, seasonal workers, conscripted workers. There are signs for different types of grain storage, received, distributed, held in reserve. The distinctions are precise. The tablets were written by scribes who understood the differences between these categories and expected others to understand them as well. The administrative apparatus existed before the writing system was refined enough to describe it in detail. Writing did not create the institutions, it recorded their functioning. At Ur, in the archive of the Third Dynasty, tablets record the output of textile workshops managed by the state. The records list workers by name, the amount of wool allocated to each, the expected quantity of finished cloth, and the date by which it was due. The system was not informal. There were quotas, there were supervisors, there were inspectors who checked the quality of the finished product. One tablet notes that a weaver named Nin Malam failed to meet her quota and was fined a specific amount of barley. The penalty is recorded without explanation. The fine was not arbitrary, it followed a rule. But the tablet does not cite the rule. It does not say, according to Regulation X, a shortfall results in penalty Y. It simply records the fine as fact. The legal structure is implied, not stated. The scribe assumes that anyone reading the tablet already knows the law. This is the characteristic feature of administrative writing throughout Sumerian history. It is documentation, not exposition. The tablets do not teach the system, they operate within it. A text from Uma lists the distribution of seed grain to farmers in preparation for planting. It records the name of each farmer, the size of the field he will plant, and the amount of seed allocated. It does not explain how field size was measured, who determined the allocation ratio, or what authority granted the distribution. The process is treated as routine. The tablet is a record of an action already completed according to procedures already established. Even legal texts exhibit this quality. The so-called law codes of Mesopotamia, such as the later Code of Hammurabi, are often described as foundational legal documents. But they are not constitutions. They do not create the law, they reference it. The laws listed in the Code of Hammurabi are phrased as conditional statements. If a man does X, then Y will result. But the text does not say why these are the laws, or who first decided them. It presents them as existing norms being recorded for reference. Earlier Sumerian legal collections, such as the laws of Ur-Nammu, follow the same structure. They list judgments and penalties, but they do not describe the origin of the legal principles behind them. The laws are treated as known, as part of a tradition that the text preserves but does not initiate. One particularly striking example comes from a tablet found at Nippur, dated to the Ur-3 period. It records a court case in which a man accused of theft was brought before a panel of judges. The tablet lists the accusation, the testimony of witnesses, and the judgment. The man was found guilty and sentenced to return the stolen goods, plus a fine. The tablet ends with the statement, "Judgment rendered according to the old regulation." The phrase, old regulation, is di ku ga gibil ba ka, meaning judgment of the former righteous decision. The court did not invent the penalty, it applied a precedent. But the precedent itself is not quoted or explained. It is simply invoked. The legal memory extends beyond the text. This reliance on prior frameworks is embedded in the structure of Sumerian administrative language. The vocabulary is dense with terms that assume institutional background. Words like engar, farmer, and jurush, labourer, are not generic. They refer to people in specific legal and economic relationships. An engar was not simply someone who ploughed a field. He was someone who held land under a particular kind of tenure, owed certain obligations, and had certain rights. The term carried legal weight. To use it was to invoke a whole set of assumptions about land, labour, and authority. The tablets do not explain these assumptions, they rely on them. The administrative archive at Drehem, ancient Pusrish Dargan, contains thousands of tablets documenting the movement of livestock. The archive functioned as a central redistribution hub. Animals were received from provincial estates, recorded, and then allocated to temples, royal households, or military units. The system required coordination across hundreds of kilometres. It required messengers, inspectors, herdsmen, accountants, and overseers. It required a calendar to synchronise transactions and a legal framework to assign responsibility for losses. All of this infrastructure is implied by the tablets, but none of it is explained by them. The tablets are the product of the system, not its blueprint. They are records generated within an already functioning apparatus. The earliest law, the earliest accounting protocol, the earliest administrative hierarchy. None of these are described in their origin. They are already in use when the texts begin. The tablets document the operation of systems whose creation is not recorded. They preserve the functioning of institutions without narrating their foundation. Writing began as a tool of administration, not a tool of history. The scribes recorded what was done, not how it came to be done. They wrote within a structure that pre-existed the act of writing. And if the structure was already there when writing began, how far back does the structure go? The Sumerian language encodes time through verb forms that are aspectual rather than strictly tensed. Sumerian verbs do not mark past, present, and future in the way familiar to speakers of Indo-European languages. Instead, they mark completion, continuity, and potentiality. The verb can indicate whether an action is finished, whether it is ongoing, whether it is expected, or whether it is being repeated. This aspectual structure gives Sumerian a particular relationship to duration and process. Actions are not primarily located in time, they are characterized by their state relative to the speaker's perspective. The result is a language well suited to describing inheritance, transmission, and continuity. One of the most common verbal constructions in Sumerian administrative and religious texts is the phrase ba'an sum, it was given. The verb sum means to give, but the prefixed morphemes indicate that the giving was completed in the past and that its effects persist into the present. The construction does not emphasize who gave or when. It emphasizes the fact that something now exists because it was given. The structure is used to describe land grants, temple offerings, divine blessings, and institutional offices. A typical royal inscription might say, "To Ur-Nammu, kingship was given by Enlil." The verb form treats the giving as a completed act with ongoing authority. Ur-Nammu does not take kingship, it is given to him. The passive construction shifts focus from the agent to the act of transmission. The king's legitimacy derives not from his own power, but from the fact that he is the recipient of something bestowed. The same structure applies to knowledge. In Sumerian wisdom literature, a teacher does not invent instruction, he passes it on. The verb used is often to bring out, or ba'an pa, was revealed. The knowledge already exists. The teacher's role is to transmit it. The student receives something that was given to the teacher, who received it from someone before him. The chain of transmission is implicit in the grammar. The verb forms treat knowledge as inheritance rather than discovery. Possessive constructions in Sumerian reinforce this sense of received identity. The language does not have a verb to have in the way English does. Instead, possession is expressed through genitive constructions and verbs of being. To say, "I have a house," in Sumerian, one would say, "The house is mine," ju. The house exists independently, and the relationship to it is one of association rather than control. This grammatical structure applies to abstract concepts as well. To speak of one's wisdom, one says, "Nam ku zu ju," my state of being wise, where nam is a nominalizing prefix that turns an adjective into a condition of being. Wisdom is not something one possesses as an object, it is a state one inhabits, and that state is inherited or bestowed. The language also has a rich vocabulary for continuity and restoration. The verb gur means to return, to restore, or to turn back. It appears frequently in royal inscriptions describing the rebuilding of temples or the restoration of cults. A king does not build a new temple, he causes the temple to return to its former state. The verb implies that the temple's proper form already exists as a reference point, and the king's work is to bring the physical structure back into alignment with that form. The verb gi is similar. It means to return or to restore, with a sense of bringing something back to its rightful place. Both verbs treat the past as normative. The proper state of things is how they were, and action in the present is measured against that prior condition. Sumerian has a specific grammatical marker for the idea of precedence or priority. The suffix ta, when attached to a noun or verb, indicates source or origin. It can mean from, because of, or since. When applied to temporal expressions, it marks the starting point of a duration, ta, from that day forward. But it can also mark conceptual origin, kurta, from the beginning, or from the first time. The construction allows scribes to locate actions within a continuum that stretches back beyond the immediate context. An inscription might say that a temple was rebuilt according to the plan from the beginning. Irirish hur igi kurta. The phrase treats the original plan as authoritative, not because it was recent, but because it was first. Even the vocabulary of creation carries this sense of pattern. The word do means to build, but it also means to make, to form, or to fashion. It is the verb used when gods create the world, when kings build temples, and when craftsmen make tools. But the verb does not imply creation from nothing. It implies shaping, assembling, or constructing according to a model. The verb is often paired with words for image, likeness, or form. The act of making is the act of giving material expression to something conceptually prior. This applies even to divine creation. When the god Enki creates humans in Sumerian myth, the verb used is do, and the humans are shaped from clay according to a design decided by the gods in assembly. The creation is crafted, not conjured. The language also distinguishes between knowledge that is learned and knowledge that is received. The verb zu means to know, and it can take different grammatical markers depending on the mode of knowing. To know something through instruction is zu-am, where the suffix am marks the status of being informed. To know something through experience is zu-be, where be indicates factual certainty. But there is also zu-lugal, the king's knowledge, or zu-abzu, knowledge of the Abzu, the primordial waters associated with the god Enki. These phrases refer to knowledge that is not learned individually, but inherited through tradition or revelation. The king knows what previous kings knew. The priest knows what was revealed in the distant past. The knowledge is not personal, it is positional. One knows because one occupies a role that carries knowledge with it. Sumerian inscriptions often use the phrase, as it was from distant days, u-uleata. The phrase appears in contexts where kings justify actions by appealing to ancient precedent. A canal is dug as it was from distant days. A festival is celebrated as it was from distant days. The phrase invokes a time before living memory, a time that serves as the reference point for correctness. The grammar treats the distant past as more authoritative than the present. The phrase does not argue for the value of the action. It simply asserts continuity with an earlier model, and that continuity is self-justifying. This grammatical emphasis on transmission, restoration, and inherited authority shapes how Sumerian texts present information. The scribes are not describing innovation, they are documenting continuity. Even when new temples are built, new kings enthroned, or new systems implemented, the language frames these events as returns, restorations, or realizations of something already known. The grammar itself is a tool of memory. It encodes a worldview in which the present is the heir of the past, and legitimacy flows from the ability to preserve what was given. But the grammar does not explain where the giving began. It marks transmission without locating origin. The language remembers that something was received, but it does not remember when the first giving occurred. In 1854, British archaeologist John George Taylor excavated at Tel al-Mukayya, the site of ancient Ur, and uncovered inscribed cylinders embedded in the corners of the ziggurat of Ur. The cylinders were foundation deposits, placed there by King Nabonidus of Babylon in the 6th century BCE. The inscriptions describes Nabonidus's restoration of the ziggurat, which he said had been built originally by Ur-Nammu king of Ur, in the 21st century BCE. Nabonidus claimed that he had searched for the foundation inscription of Ur-Nammu, found it, and restored the structure to its original plan. The inscriptions were detailed. They described the dimensions, the materials, and the orientation. Nabonidus's rebuilding was an act of preservation. But the text says something else as well. Nabonidus states that Ur-Nammu himself had rebuilt the ziggurat, restoring it after it had fallen into decay. Ur-Nammu's inscription, also discovered by Taylor, confirmed this. Ur-Nammu described the ziggurat as already ancient in his own time. He did not claim to have designed it. He claimed to have rebuilt it according to its original form. The ziggurat of Ur, therefore, was understood by its builders as a restoration of an earlier structure, which was itself understood as a restoration of something earlier still. The continuity was intentional. Each king who rebuilt the ziggurat claimed to be preserving a form that predated him. The architectural history of the structure is layered, but the ideological history is linear. Each phase is presented as an attempt to return to an original, a form that existed before the first known inscription. Excavations beneath the Ur-3 foundations revealed older mud brick platforms, evidence of earlier construction phases that were not recorded in inscriptions. The physical evidence supports the claim. The ziggurat site was sacred and built upon long before Ur-Nammu's reign. But the texts do not say when the site first became sacred or who first built there. They say only that it was already sacred when the known kings began their work. At Eridu, foundation inscriptions from the Temple of Enki describe similar patterns. King Amar-Suen of Ur, around 2040 BCE, rebuilt the Abzu, the Temple of the Freshwater Abyss, and inscribed bricks with the statement that he had restored it to its ancient glory. But earlier inscriptions from the same temple, dating to the early dynastic period, use identical language. Kings of Eridu in the 3rd millennium claimed to be restoring what was already ancient. Excavations at the site revealed the 17 successive temples mentioned earlier, each built on the ruins of the one before. But none of the inscriptions claim to have founded the temple. They claim to have rebuilt it. The identity of the founder is not recorded. The temple exists because it has always existed there. The kings do not create the temple, they maintain it. This pattern appears across Mesopotamia. At Nippur, the Ekur temple of Enlil was rebuilt repeatedly over 2 millennia. Each rebuilding was accompanied by foundation deposits containing inscriptions that invoked prior construction. The kings who rebuilt the Ekur described themselves as acting according to the original plan, or as it was from the beginning. The Ekur is treated as older than any recorded king. Even the earliest inscriptions do not claim to mark the temple's origin, they claim to mark a restoration. The implication is that the temple predates written memory. The structure may have been rebuilt many times, but the sanctity of the site is treated as primordial. At Lagash, an early dynastic ruler named Ur-Nanshe left an inscription describing his construction of the temple of Ningirsu, the city's patron god. But the inscription does not say he founded the temple, it says he renewed it. The verb used is gur, to return or to restore. Ur-Nanshe was not creating a temple where none existed, he was rebuilding one that had stood before. Later rulers of Lagash, such as Gudea, also rebuilt the temple of Ningirsu. Gudea's inscriptions are among the most detailed temple-building accounts in Sumerian literature. They describe the king receiving instructions from the god in a dream, consulting omens, gathering materials from distant lands, and overseeing the construction. But even Gudea describes his work as restoration. He says the temple had fallen into ruin and that he rebuilt it according to its former appearance. The old plan was the model. The king's role was to execute it faithfully. This ideology of restoration extended to temple rituals as well. At Uruk, an inscription from the Eanna temple describes the reinstitution of a festival that had been interrupted. The text does not explain why the festival had ceased, or how long it had been discontinued. It simply states that the festival was restored as it was performed in ancient times. The ritual knowledge was not invented, it was remembered. Someone knew how the festival had been performed before, and that memory was authoritative. The resumption of the ritual was treated as the correction of an error, a return to proper practice. Sumerian hymns often describe temples as eternal. A hymn to the Ekur at Nippur says, "The Ekur, whose foundation is laid in the Abzu being the primordial underground ocean, the source of all fresh water, and, symbolically, the source of all order and wisdom." The temple's foundation is not in the ground, it is in the Abzu, the unchanging cosmic order. The physical temple is a manifestation of something more fundamental. The hymn treats the temple not as a structure built at a particular moment in history, but as an expression of a reality that always existed. The king who builds or rebuilds the temple is not creating it. He is making visible what was already there. Even in mundane construction records, this attitude persists. At tablets document the dredging of canals, and several note that the canal was being cleared as it was dug in former years. The phrase treats the canal's original path as the correct path. Deviation is error, restoration is correctness. The scribes did not describe the canal as infrastructure designed by engineers to solve contemporary problems. They described it as a channel being returned to its proper form, a form established by prior generations. The texts do not name the original builders. Foundation inscriptions invoke the ancestors, the kings of old, or the distant days, but they do not provide names or dates. The earliest temples are attributed to gods or to legendary kings whose historicity is uncertain. At Babylon, the temple of Marduk, the Esagila, was said to have been built by the gods themselves at the creation of the world. Later kings restored it. At Ashur, the temple of the god Ashur was said to have been founded at the beginning of time. These statements are not meant as historical claims in the modern sense. They are ways of expressing the temple's antiquity beyond human reckoning. The temple is older than memory. Its origin is not accessible to the scribes, but its existence is continuous, preserved through endless cycles of rebuilding. If temples are treated as older than their gods, what foundation were they built on? Tablet BM 36731, acquired by the British Museum in the early 20th century, is a star catalogue written in cuneiform. It is dated to the Kassite period, around the 14th century BCE, but the observations it records are older. The text lists constellations, names specific stars, and provides angular measurements describing their positions relative to one another. The list is systematic. Stars are grouped by region of the sky. Each entry includes a name, a description, and a numerical value indicating position. The precision is notable. Angles are given in degrees and fractions, and distances are expressed in units that correspond to observable sky motion. The tablet is not a poetic description of the heavens. It is a reference document, a tool for prediction and calculation. But it contains no preamble, no explanation of how the observations were made or when the catalogue was compiled. It begins with the data, as if the reader already knows the purpose and the method. This is characteristic of Mesopotamian astronomical texts. They present observational results without documenting the process of observation. Another tablet from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, dated to the 7th century BCE, contains a series called the Mul Apin, named after the constellation of the Plough. The series includes star lists, rising and setting times, and a calendar correlated to stellar events. The Mul Apin texts are structured as reference tables. They list phenomena in sequence. On day X of month Y, star Z rises. The entries span a full year, tracking the heliacal risings of key stars, the moment when a star first becomes visible on the eastern horizon just before dawn. Predicting these risings required long-term observation. A single year of watching the sky is insufficient. Atmospheric conditions, seasonal visibility, and the gradual precession of the equinoxes mean that accurate prediction requires data accumulated over decades, perhaps centuries. Yet the texts present the information as complete. They do not describe the accumulation of knowledge, they present the result. The Babylonian astronomical diaries, which begin in the 7th century BCE but reference earlier observations, record planetary positions, lunar phases, and weather conditions. The diaries were maintained continuously for over 700 years. They are among the longest continuous scientific records in human history. The entries are terse. Month X, night Y. Jupiter was 2 cubits above the Moon. The cubit is a rough angular measure, approximately 2 degrees. The precision varies, but the consistency is remarkable. The diaries assume an ongoing tradition of observation. Each scribe adds to a record started by his predecessors. The continuity is institutional. The diaries were kept in temples, maintained by priestly scholars whose role included watching the sky. The tradition required training, standardization, and intergenerational transmission. Scribes had to learn not only how to observe, but what to observe and how to record it in the standardized form. But where did the tradition begin? The earliest astronomical texts from Mesopotamia, such as the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa from the Old Babylonian period, around 1600 BCE, already assume systematic observation. The tablet records the visibility of Venus over a period of 21 years. It notes when Venus appeared in the east before sunrise, when it disappeared, when it reappeared in the west after sunset, and how many days passed between phases. The data is precise enough that modern astronomers have attempted to use it to determine absolute chronology. The observations require a stable calendar, a standardized method of timekeeping, and a conceptual framework that treats the movements of Venus as cyclical and predictable. All of this was already in place when the tablet was written. The text is not the beginning of observation, it is the continuation of a practice that must have begun earlier. Sumerian texts contain references to astronomical knowledge even earlier. A lexical list from the early dynastic period, around 2600 BCE, includes names for constellations. The names are Sumerian, Mul, star, followed by descriptive terms, Mul Apin, the plough, Mul Mash, the twins. The list does not explain the constellations or describe their positions, it simply names them. The names were already known. By the time the list was written, the sky had been organized into named regions. The stars were not a chaotic scatter, they were grouped into recognizable patterns, and those patterns had names that were stable enough to be written down and taught. Astronomical observation in Mesopotamia was closely tied to the calendar. The Mesopotamian calendar was lunisolar. It followed the cycles of the moon, but periodically adjusted to keep in sync with the solar year. This required intercalation, the addition of extra months at regular intervals. Deciding when to intercalate required tracking both lunar and solar cycles simultaneously. The process was mathematically complex. Tablets from the Seleucid period, around the 3rd century BCE, contain calculation schemes for predicting lunar and solar eclipses, determining the length of the month, and computing the positions of planets. These calculations use sophisticated mathematical techniques, including iterative approximation and numerical series. But the techniques were not invented in the Seleucid period. They were refinements of methods already in use centuries earlier. The accuracy of Babylonian astronomy is now well documented. Modern reconstructions of ancient celestial events confirm that Babylonian predictions of eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and heliacal risings were often correct to within a few hours. This level of accuracy required not only careful observation, but also mathematical models that could predict future positions based on past data. The models were empirical. They were derived from patterns observed in the data rather than from theoretical principles. But building such models required extensive data sets. The Babylonian astronomers had access to records stretching back centuries. The continuity of the record was what made prediction possible. Without that continuity, the patterns would not have been visible. Yet the texts do not describe the origin of the tradition. They do not say, in the reign of King X, astronomers began to track the rising of Venus. They do not name the first observer or explain what motivated the initial observations. The practice is treated as ongoing when the texts begin. The scribes record observations, but they do not record the decision to observe. The tradition appears fully formed in the written record, already equipped with standardized terminology, systematic methods, and institutional support. By the time writing preserves astronomy, astronomy is already old. One tablet from Uruk, dated to the late Uruk period, around 3000 BCE, contains a pictographic sign that later scholars identify as mul, star. The sign appears in administrative contexts, possibly referencing time or festivals tied to celestial events. If the identification is correct, it suggests that astronomical observation was already tied to institutional functions, temple rituals, agricultural scheduling, or administrative calendars, before the development of full cuneiform script. The sky was already being watched, and the watching was already systematic enough to be referenced in economic records. The practice predates its detailed documentation. The stars were named before the names were explained. If observation required generations of accumulated data, who began the watch? Tablet IM 58045, excavated from Tel Harmal near Baghdad, is dated to the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE. It contains a list of mathematical problems and their solutions. One problem describes a square field of unknown side length and asks the student to calculate the side given the area. The solution is provided step by step using a procedure that involves taking the square root. The text does not explain what a square root is or why the procedure works. It simply demonstrates the method. The student is expected to follow the steps and apply them to similar problems. The text is pedagogical, but it is not foundational. It teaches technique, not theory. The mathematical knowledge is already developed. The tablet trains scribes in the use of methods that were already standard. Another mathematical tablet from the same period, YBC 7289, housed in the Yale Babylonian collection, contains a diagram of a square with two diagonals drawn. Along one side of the square is inscribed the number 30. Along one diagonal is inscribed a number that, when translated into modern notation, represents the square root of 2 carried to 6 significant figures, 1.414213. The calculation is accurate to within 1 part in a million. The tablet does not explain how this number was derived. It does not show the computation. It simply presents the result. The scribe who wrote the tablet knew how to calculate square roots to extraordinary precision, and he knew that such precision was worth recording. But the text does not teach the method, it demonstrates the outcome. The knowledge was already possessed when the tablet was made. Mesopotamian mathematics was highly developed. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period contained solutions to quadratic equations, calculations of compound interest, geometric problems involving circles and triangles, and metrological conversions between different units of measurement. The problems are practical: field area, grain storage, labor allocation, construction materials. But the methods are abstract. The tablets use algebraic reasoning, even though they do not use symbolic notation. Quantities are represented by words or ideograms, and operations are described procedurally. The structure is mathematical, even if the language is not. The scribes were performing operations equivalent to solving systems of linear equations, finding roots, and manipulating geometric ratios. They had techniques for these operations, and the techniques were standardized. Different scribes in different cities solved the same types of problems using the same methods. The metrological system itself implies mathematical sophistication. Sumerian measures for length, area, volume, and weight were not arbitrary. They were structured in ways that facilitated calculation. The system used a combination of decimal and sexagesimal bases. Distances and areas often used base 10 multiples, while time and angular measurement used base 60. The sexagesimal system inherited and expanded by the Babylonians, is the origin of our division of the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds. It is also the origin of the division of the circle into 360 degrees. The choice of base 60 was not accidental. 60 has many divisors, which makes it useful for fractional calculations. 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 1/5, 1/6, 1/10, 1/12, 1/15, 1/20, and 1/30 of 60 are all whole numbers. This makes mental arithmetic easier and reduces the need for fractional notation. The system was designed for computation. But when was it designed? The earliest written numbers from Mesopotamia, found on proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk around 3200 BCE, already use a complex system of numerical notation. Different symbols represent different magnitudes depending on context. The same sign can mean 10 in one context and 60 in another, depending on what is being counted. The scribes who used this system understood the distinctions. The notation was not confused. It was flexible, adapted to the thing being measured. The system was already sophisticated when writing began. The standardization implies prior development. Someone had to decide that 60 was a useful base, that certain units should relate to one another in specific ratios, and that these relationships should be taught and enforced. The tablets do not name the designer. The system is already in use when the tablets begin. At Shuruppak, early dynastic tablets from around 2600 BCE include accounts that use standardized measures for grain, oil, and textiles. The measures are consistent across multiple tablets, indicating institutional regulation. The scribes were not improvising, they were following a standard. At Lagash, tablets from the reign of Uruk-agina, around 2350 BCE, list quantities of barley distributed as rations. The amounts are given in gur, a large unit equal to roughly 300 litres, and in smaller subdivisions, bariga, ban, and sila. The relationships between these units are fixed. 1 gur equals 5 bariga, 1 bariga equals 6 ban, 1 ban equals 10 sila. The system is hierarchical and precise. Conversion between units is straightforward because the ratios are standardized. The standardization required coordination. Scribes in different cities had to use the same units and the same conversion ratios, or trade and taxation would become impossible. The system was not local, it was regional, perhaps even broader. And it was already functioning in the 3rd millennium BCE. The mathematical training of scribes was systematic. Lexical lists include tables of multiplication, reciprocals, squares, and cubes. A student scribe would memorize these tables as part of his education. The tables were tools, references to be used in solving problems. A tablet from Nippur contains a complete multiplication table for the number 9, listing 9 times 1 through 9 times 20. Another contains a table of reciprocals, numbers paired with their multiplicative inverses. These tables were not discoveries, they were computational aids. The scribe learned them by rote and applied them in calculation. The knowledge was procedural, passed from teacher to student across generations. The continuity was deliberate. The scribes were trained in methods that had been developed before them, and they trained the next generation in the same methods. But the texts do not explain where the methods originated. There are no Mesopotamian tablets that describe the invention of mathematics. There are no accounts of a mathematician who first realized that the area of a rectangle equals length times width, or who first developed the procedure for extracting square roots. The methods are already in use when the tablets begin. The knowledge is treated as given, as part of the intellectual inheritance of the scribal class. The scribes were trained in calculation because calculation was necessary for administration, and administration required precision. The mathematics served the state. It was practical knowledge, refined over time, transmitted through institutions. But the beginning of that refinement is not documented. By the time the texts preserve the mathematics is already old. If the methods were inherited, who first refined them? Tablet CBS 14064, held in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, is a legal text from the city of Nippur, dated to the Ur-3 period around 2100 BCE. It records a dispute over inheritance. A man named Lu Ninshubur died without leaving a written will. His two sons both claimed rights to his house and a small plot of land. The case was brought before a local assembly of elders, who heard testimony from neighbours and reviewed what the text calls earlier judgments. The assembly ruled that the property should be divided equally, unless one son could prove he had been designated as primary heir by the father before witnesses. No such proof was provided, so the property was split. The ruling is documented in the tablet, and it concludes with a statement, "Judgment rendered in accordance with former law." The phrase is Di Gibil Bar Nuzu, meaning judgment of the righteous decision not known, implying that the law applied was not newly made, but referenced from an earlier, unwritten tradition. This is not an isolated case. Hundreds of legal tablets from Sumerian cities contain similar references to precedent. A tablet from Lagash describes a case in which a woman sued her brother for withholding her share of an estate. The court ruled in her favour and ordered restitution according to the old regulation. Another tablet from Ur records a dispute over water rights between two farmers. The judges examined the boundaries of the fields and consulted the earlier division of the canal, a reference to a prior administrative decision that had defined water access. The court did not invent a solution, it applied a prior ruling. The system was built on memory. Judges did not decide what was fair in the abstract, they decided what had been decided before. This reliance on precedent suggests the existence of a body of legal knowledge that was not always written down. Many of the earlier decisions referenced in Ur-3 tablets are not preserved in the archive. Either they were recorded on materials that did not survive, or they were part of an oral tradition maintained by judges and elders. The references are specific enough to suggest real decisions, not vague custom. A tablet might say, "as was judged in the time of the Ensi Ur-Bao," naming a specific official and implying a documented ruling. But the ruling itself is not cited in full. The scribe assumes the reader knows the case or can consult it. The legal memory extended beyond the individual tablet. It was institutional, preserved in the collective knowledge of the scribal and judicial classes. The so-called Laws of Ur-Nammu, one of the earliest law collections, date to around 2100 BCE. The text is fragmentary, but what survives includes a prologue and a series of conditional laws. If a man commits X, then Y shall be done. The prologue describes Ur-Nammu as a king who established justice in the land, and who made the orphan not fall prey to the wealthy, the widow not fall prey to the powerful. The language is restorative. Ur-Nammu is correcting abuses, not inventing law. The laws that follow are phrased as reforms. They describe penalties for crimes and compensation for injuries, but they do not claim to be the origin of legal order. They claim to be a codification of what justice requires. The text treats justice as something that already exists and that the king's laws are meant to reflect. Even earlier, fragments of legal language appear in administrative texts from the early dynastic period. A tablet from Lagash, dated to around 2400 BCE, describes the reforms of Urukagina, a ruler who restored the customs of former times and who freed the city from usury, theft, and murder. The inscription lists specific abuses that Urukagina corrected: tax collectors who extorted farmers, officials who seized livestock, priests who appropriated temple property. The reforms are described as a return to righteousness. Urukagina did not claim to invent new law, he claimed to restore old law that had been violated. The inscription treats the proper legal order as something known, something that could be violated and then restored. The standard was prior. Legal terminology in Sumerian reflects this understanding. The word for law, di, also means judgment, decision, or case. It is a word that refers to the act of judging as much as to the rule applied. Law was not an abstract code, it was the accumulation of judgments. Each case added to the body of legal memory. The word for justice, nij-sisa, means that which is straight, or that which is correct. Justice was not arbitrary, it was alignment with a correct order. The judge's task was not to create that order, but to recognize it and apply it. The law was discovered through judgment, not invented by decree. Court records from the city of Isin, dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, describe judges consulting with scribes to review earlier cases. The scribes functioned as legal archivists, keepers of precedent. Their role was to provide the judges with access to prior rulings so that consistency could be maintained. The system required literacy, record-keeping, and institutional continuity. It also required that someone in the past had made the original decisions that became precedents. The earliest judgments set patterns that later judges followed, but the earliest judgments are not preserved. The legal tradition extends backward, beyond the reach of the surviving texts. When the tablets begin to document law, law is already functioning. The system is already established. The laws of Lipit Ishtar, from around 1930 BCE, are another example. The prologue states that the king was called by the gods to bring justice to the land, and that he established justice according to the word of Enlil. The laws are framed as divine will, but they are also practical. They cover property disputes, marriage contracts, slavery, and agricultural tenancy. The laws are detailed, implying that the situations they address were common enough to require standardized responses. The standardization implies prior experience. The laws codify what had already been judged many times. They are not experimental, they are summary. One particularly striking feature of Mesopotamian legal texts is the absence of a concept of legislative creation. There are no Mesopotamian texts that describe a king or assembly inventing law. Kings issue edicts, but edicts are temporary. They address specific situations or abuses. Law is treated as more fundamental. It is inherited, remembered, and applied. The king's role is to uphold it, not to author it. Even royal edicts are framed as restorations of justice rather than innovations. The language is always retrospective. The law was already there. The king makes it effective again. If the law was remembered, who first established what the judges remembered? Tablet K162, part of the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, contains a medical text titled, "If a man's body is afflicted." The text is a diagnostic manual. It lists symptoms and associates them with diseases, prognoses, and treatments. The structure is systematic. If a man's head aches and his eyes are yellow, the disease is jaundice. You shall treat him with. The treatments are practical: herbal remedies, dietary restrictions, incantations. The text is not myth. It is not a theological explanation of suffering. It is a technical manual used by physicians. The tablet is dated to the 7th century BCE, but the content it preserves is older. Colophons at the end of the text, scribal notes indicating authorship and provenance, state that the tablet is a copy of an earlier Babylonian original. The medical knowledge was transmitted across centuries, copied and recopied, preserved in institutional archives. Sumerian medical texts are even older. A tablet from Nippur, dated to around 2000 BCE, is one of the earliest known medical documents. It contains prescriptions for treating wounds, digestive ailments, and skin conditions. The prescriptions are formulaic. Grind together seeds of plant X, mix with oil, apply to the affected area. The remedies are not accompanied by explanations. The text does not say why the treatment works or what the underlying cause of the illness is. It simply states what should be done. The knowledge is procedural. The physician is expected to follow the instructions, not to understand the theory behind them. The text is a reference, not a teaching document. The physician already knows how to prepare the remedy. He consults the tablet to confirm the correct ingredients and proportions. The language of Sumerian medicine is empirical. Symptoms are described in observational terms: color, texture, temperature, location of pain. Diagnoses are based on patterns. If these symptoms occur together, the condition is X. Prognoses are stated probabilistically. He will recover. He will not recover. The disease will persist. The predictions are based on experience. Physicians observed outcomes and learned which symptoms predicted which results. The knowledge was accumulated over time and transmitted through texts and training. Each generation of physicians inherited the observations of the previous generation. Some Sumerian medical texts include references to divine causation, illness sent by gods or demons, but even these texts prescribe practical treatments. The gods may have caused the illness, but the physician treats it with medicine, not with prayer alone. Incantations are often included alongside prescriptions, but they are part of the treatment protocol, not a substitute for it. The physician addresses both the supernatural cause and the physical symptoms. The approach is holistic, but not purely magical. The remedies had to work, or they would not have been preserved. One medical text from Ur describes treatments for broken bones. The text instructs the physician to set the bone, immobilize the limb, and apply a poultice to reduce swelling. The procedure is surgical. It requires anatomical knowledge, understanding where bones are, how they connect, and how they heal. The physician has to recognize when a bone is properly aligned and when it is not. The text assumes this knowledge. It does not teach anatomy. It assumes the physician has already learned it. The text is a protocol, a reminder of the steps to follow in treatment. Another tablet describes remedies for eye conditions. The prescriptions include washing the eye with herbal infusions, applying ointments, and avoiding certain foods. The treatments are non-invasive and topical. They reflect an understanding of the eye as a sensitive organ that can be treated externally without surgery. The knowledge is practical and specific. The physician knows which plants have astringent properties, which reduce inflammation, and which soothe irritation. The knowledge is botanical as well as medical. It requires familiarity with the natural environment, with the properties of plants, and with methods of preparation. Sumerian physicians were professionals. Tablets list their names and titles. The title Azu, water knower, or physician, appears in administrative records, often in lists of temple or palace personnel. Physicians were employed by institutions. They were trained, paid, and expected to perform their duties according to established practices. The role was specialized. Not every scribe was a physician, and not every priest was a healer. The knowledge was restricted to those who had undergone training. The training required literacy, access to texts, and apprenticeship under an experienced physician. The system was institutional. Knowledge was transmitted through formal education, not through casual observation. The medical texts do not describe the origin of the knowledge. They do not say, in the reign of King X, the treatment for jaundice was discovered. They present the knowledge as given. The remedies are listed as facts. The physician learns what works, not how it was discovered. The tradition is one of inheritance. Each physician receives the accumulated knowledge of his predecessors and adds his own observations. The process is gradual and collective. No single individual invented Sumerian medicine. It was built over generations. But the texts do not document that process. They preserve the result without narrating the discovery. Some medical tablets include annotations, notes added by later scribes indicating that a treatment was tested or modified. One tablet from Babylon includes a marginal note: "I have tried this remedy and it is effective." The note is evidence of ongoing practice. The knowledge was not static, it was updated through experience. But the updates were additions, not replacements. The old remedies were not discarded, they were preserved alongside the new. The tradition valued continuity. Even when new treatments were discovered, the old texts were copied and transmitted. The archive grew, but it did not reset. If medicine was inherited, not revealed, who made the first observations? Tablet VAT 5643, held in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, is an administrative text from the Ur III period. It lists the names of several gods: Enlil, Ninlil, Ninurta, Enki. And next to each name is a number. The numbers are not offerings or epithets. They are personnel assignments. The tablet is a duty roster. It lists how many workers are assigned to the cults of each god. Enlil's temple receives 40 workers. Enki's temple receives 20. The workers are not slaves. They are state employees, ration recipients, labourers performing maintenance, cleaning, and ritual tasks. The tablet treats the gods as administrative categories. They are not remote cosmic beings. They are the heads of departments. The gods have households, estates, and budgets. They have staff. This is characteristic of how the Anunnaki appear in administrative texts. The term Anunnaki means those of the princely seed, or offspring of Anu, Anu being the sky god. In mythological texts, the Anunnaki are sometimes described as the great gods who decree fates, or who dwell in the underworld. But in administrative and legal contexts, the Anunnaki are referenced as a class of functionaries. A tablet from Girsu lists the 50 Anunnaki of Lagash and describes their rations. Another text refers to the great Anunnaki, the judges, indicating a judicial role. The Anunnaki are not abstractions. They are named, numbered, and embedded in institutional structures. One tablet from Nippur describes a festival at which offerings are made before the Anunnaki. The offerings are specific: bread, beer, dates, sheep. The quantities are recorded. The offerings are not symbolic gestures, they are material transactions. The goods are delivered to the temple, recorded in the archive, and presumably consumed or redistributed. The system is economic. The gods receive goods, and the temple redistributes them to priests, workers, and dependents. The gods are nodes in a distribution network. They are economic actors in a managed system. In legal texts, the Anunnaki appear as witnesses. A tablet from Ur records an oath taken before the Anunnaki and the king. The oath is part of a contract. The invoking of the Anunnaki is not a prayer, it is a legal formula. The Anunnaki are invoked to hold the parties accountable. They are guarantors of the agreement. The language is formal and procedural. The gods are part of the legal apparatus. They enforce contracts, witness oaths, and judge disputes. Their role is institutional, not personal. Mythological texts present a different image. In compositions like the Enuma Elish or the Atrahasis, the Anunnaki are creators, deciders, warriors. They shape the cosmos, establish order, and assign roles to lesser gods. These texts are cosmological. They describe the structure of the universe, the relationships among divine powers, and the origins of humanity. But even in myth, the Anunnaki are administrators. In the Atrahasis, the gods complain about the burden of labour, digging canals, maintaining irrigation systems, producing food. The work is administrative, not abstract. The gods are depicted as managing the world, not merely inhabiting it. The Anunnaki's role as judges is particularly prominent. In the descent of Inanna, the goddess Inanna is judged by the Anunnaki when she enters the underworld. The judges do not speak. They render a verdict through their presence. The scene is formal. The Anunnaki are enthroned, and their judgment is final. The text treats judgment as a function, not a narrative event. The gods judge because that is their role. They are judicial officers in a cosmic bureaucracy. Hymns and prayers address the Anunnaki collectively. A hymn from Ur praises Enlil, who commands the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki are not independent. They are subordinate to higher gods. The hierarchy is explicit. Enlil assigns tasks, and the Anunnaki execute them. The structure is managerial. The gods form a chain of command. The Anunnaki are the middle tier, below the great gods like Enlil, Anu, and Enki, but above the minor gods who handle specific, localized functions. One administrative text from the Ur-3 period lists the houses of the Anunnaki and assigns them storage quotas. The Anunnaki have houses, physical locations associated with their cults. The houses are economic units. They have inventories, personnel, and obligations. The tablet treats them as part of the state's logistical apparatus. The gods are taxpayers, or at least their temples are. The system is integrated. Divine and human economies are not separate. They are interwoven. The gods receive goods from the state, and the state claims legitimacy from the gods. In no text do the Anunnaki create the systems they oversee. They do not invent kingship, law, agriculture, or writing. They administer them. They assign roles, witness agreements, judge disputes, and receive offerings. They function within a structure that already exists. Even in cosmological myths, the Anunnaki do not create order from chaos. They organize what is already present. In the Enuma Elish, the gods defeat Tiamat and use her body to create the world. But the world they create is immediately organized, assigned, divided, and administered. There is no period of experimentation or development. The cosmos is structured as soon as it exists. The gods are administrators of that structure. The Anunnaki are described as wise, powerful, and eternal. But they are not described as originators. They do not claim to have established the principles they enforce. They uphold order, but they do not narrate its origin. The texts treat the Anunnaki as inheritors of their roles, just as human kings are inheritors of kingship. The gods are positioned within a system, not outside it. Their authority is real, but it is also positional. They rule because they occupy the offices that give them the right to rule. And if the offices pre-exist the gods who occupy them, where did the offices come from? The archaeological site of Tel Asmar in the Diyala region contains the ruins of the ancient city of Eshnunna. Excavations in the 1930s uncovered the administrative quarter of the city, including the palace and a large archive building. The archive contained over 2,000 tablets dating from the early dynastic through the old Akkadian periods, spanning roughly 2,600 to 2,200 BCE. The tablets are not literary, they are records. Inventories of grain, lists of workers, tax receipts, loan agreements, ration distributions. The tablets document the operation of the state. They show how resources were moved, how labour was organised, how the economy was managed. The system was extensive. Goods flowed in from rural estates, were recorded at central depots, and were redistributed to temple personnel, palace dependents, and military units. The archive preserves the mechanism of that flow. What is immediately striking about the archive is not what it contains, but what it does not contain. There are no foundation myths. There are no cosmological narratives. There are no hymns or prayers. The archive is purely administrative. The scribes who worked there were not poets or theologians. They were accountants. Their work was to track and verify. They recorded what came in and what went out. They documented obligations and ensured compliance. The tablets are the infrastructure of memory. They are the proof that the system was functioning and the tool by which it continued to function. Other archives show the same pattern. At Girsu, the archive of the temple of the goddess Bao contains tens of thousands of tablets, almost all administrative. At Drehem, the livestock redistribution centre mentioned earlier, the archive is entirely economic. At the palace archive from the III period is dominated by records of textile production, metal imports, and labour assignments. The mythological texts that modern scholars know, Gilgamesh, Inanna, the creation myths, come from a small number of sites, mostly from later periods, and mostly from temple libraries or scribal schools. The bulk of cuneiform writing is not myth, it is management. This raises a question about what Sumerian writing was for. Writing was not invented to record stories, it was invented to record transactions. The earliest tablets from Uruk are not epics, they are receipts. They list goods received, goods distributed, and the names of officials responsible for the transactions. Writing emerged as a tool of the state, a technology for managing complexity. As cities grew, as populations increased, as trade expanded, memory became insufficient. The flow of goods and people had to be tracked, and oral transmission was inadequate. Writing fixed information. It made it portable, verifiable, and permanent. The earliest scribes were not storytellers, they were record keepers. The mythological texts that survive are pedagogical. They were copied in scribal schools as part of the curriculum. Students learn to write by copying literary compositions. The texts taught grammar, vocabulary, and proper form. But they were not the primary product of literacy. They were the training material. The real work of the scribe was the administrative tablet, the field survey, the inventory, the receipt. The literary texts were learned so that the administrative texts could be written correctly. The myths were the curriculum, not the profession. Even the myths, when examined closely, are structured like records. They list names, genealogies, sequences of events, and outcomes. The Sumerian king list is myth written as archive. The list treats legendary kings and historical kings the same way: name, city, reign length. The format is administrative. The Eridu Genesis is a myth, but it is also a sequence: creation, flood, restoration. The structure is chronological and causal. The gods act, events occur, consequences follow. The narrative is organized like a legal case or a historical annex. The literary tradition borrowed the structure of the archive. Even when Sumerians told stories, they told them like scribes. This preference for documentation over narration is reflected in how the Sumerians remembered their own past. There are no Sumerian histories in the modern sense, no continuous narrative accounts of the rise and fall of dynasties, the causes of wars, or the development of culture. What survive are king lists, year names, building inscriptions, and votive dedications. These are not narratives, they are markers. They anchor events in time, but they do not explain them. A king's reign is remembered by the temples he built and the campaigns he fought, but the motivations, the strategies, the consequences, these are left unstated. The record is factual, not interpretive. The scribe documents what was done, not why it was done. At Lagash, a collection of dedicatory cones, small clay objects inscribed with a king's name and a statement of construction, were embedded in the walls of temples and public buildings. The inscriptions are formulaic. For the god X, King Y built this temple. The cones serve as permanent records, buried in the structure itself. They are not meant to be read by the public. They are declarations to the gods and to future restorers. The inscriptions are memory encoded in architecture. The building remembers who built it and why. The structure itself is the archive. This use of the material world as a site of memory is central to Sumerian culture. Temples, walls, canals, and steles all carried inscriptions. The land was written on. The city was a text. Every major structure bore witness to its own construction, and that witness was permanent. When later kings rebuilt temples, they uncovered the foundation deposits of earlier kings and copied the inscriptions. The act of rebuilding was also an act of reading. The past was excavated, transcribed, and reaffirmed. The continuity was physical as well as textual. The scribes copied tablets, and the kings copied buildings. Both acts preserved memory. The archive, therefore, was not just a collection of tablets in a room. It was a distributed system of memory, spread across inscriptions, structures, and institutions. The tablets in the archive recorded daily transactions, but the temples recorded devotion, the walls recorded power, and the fields recorded law. The entire landscape was a form of documentation. The Sumerians did not separate record-keeping from reality. They embedded records in the structures of daily life. The city itself was the archive. And the archive preserved not the origin of the systems it documented, but their continuous operation. The records assume the system. They do not explain it. They verify it. If the archive is continuous, What came before the first tablet? A cuneiform tablet from Ugarit, a coastal city in modern Syria, contains a version of the flood myth that closely resembles the Sumerian and Akkadian accounts. The tablet is written in Ugaritic, a different language, using an alphabetic script, not cuneiform syllabary. Yet the content is structurally similar. A great flood, a divine warning, a survivor who builds a boat, the preservation of life, and the resumption of order afterward. The flood motif appears in cultures across the ancient Near East, Hittite, Hurrian, and later Hebrew traditions. Each version has local variations, but the core narrative remains recognizable. The theme of catastrophic inundation, followed by divine restoration, is widely distributed. In Egypt, the concept of Ma'at, cosmic order, truth, and justice, functions similarly to the Sumerian idea of Mi, the divine principles that govern the universe. Ma'at is maintained by the pharaoh, who is responsible for upholding the cosmic balance. The pharaoh does not create Ma'at, he preserves it. Deviation from Ma'at brings chaos, and restoration is the return to the proper order established by the gods. The language is different, but the conceptual structure is parallel. Order is inherited, not invented. Rulers are stewards, not originators. In the Indus Valley, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro exhibit urban planning that suggests centralized coordination. The cities have grid layouts, standardized brick sizes, and sophisticated drainage systems. The consistency across sites implies a shared model. Yet there are no texts to explain the planning. The Indus script remains undeciphered, and the culture left no deciphered records of governance or cosmology. The cities were built according to a plan, but the plan is not documented. The knowledge was operational, but it was not written down, or if it was, the writing has not been translated. The parallel with Sumer is suggestive. Complex urbanism appears without documented precedent. The knowledge seems inherited, but the origin is inaccessible. In Anatolia, the Hittites inherited much of their legal and administrative vocabulary from earlier Mesopotamian traditions. Hittite treaties, legal codes, and diplomatic correspondence use formulaic language and structures that resemble Babylonian models. The Hittites did not claim to have invented diplomacy or international law. They participated in systems that already existed. Their treaties reference earlier agreements, invoke shared gods, and assume mutual understanding of protocol. The system was international, spanning multiple language groups and political entities. The coordination implies long-standing norms, not ad hoc negotiation. Even in regions farther from Mesopotamia, similar patterns appear. In China, early dynastic texts describe the transfer of the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule, which passes from one dynasty to another based on moral conduct. The mandate is not created by the ruler, it is bestowed by heaven and can be revoked. The ruler's legitimacy depends on maintaining harmony and justice, concepts treated as eternal and external to human authority. The structure is different from Sumerian kingship, but the underlying logic is similar. Authority is inherited, conditional, and rooted in a cosmic order that predates human institutions. The common thread is the treatment of order as prior. Across cultures, the institutions that govern society, law, kingship, temple ritual, urban planning, are described as inheritances rather than inventions. The mythologies differ, the languages differ, but the claim is the same. The systems that organize human life were given, not made. They are maintained, restored, transmitted, but not originated by the people who use them. The past is normative. The future is a continuation, not a departure. This raises the question of convergence versus transmission. Did these cultures independently develop similar ideas, or did they inherit them from a common source? The archaeological record shows extensive contact. Trade routes connected Mesopotamia to Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and Central Asia. Goods, people, and ideas moved along these routes. Cultural diffusion is documented. The spread of cylinder seals, pottery styles, metallurgical techniques, and even script forms shows that knowledge travelled. But does similarity in conceptual structure imply transmission? Or does it reflect universal human responses to similar challenges? The question cannot be answered definitively. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. What is clear is that the Sumerian claim to have inherited, rather than invented, their civilization was not unique. It was part of a broader pattern of thought in the ancient world. The Sumerians were not alone in describing their knowledge as received. They were part of a wider tradition that treated the past as the source of legitimacy and the origin of order. Whether that tradition was shared through contact or arose independently, it was widespread, and it lasted. The idea that civilization is inherited, not created, persisted for millennia. It shaped how ancient peoples understood themselves, their rulers, and their gods. It framed memory as restoration, not accumulation, and it left the question of ultimate origin unanswered. If order was inherited across so many cultures, where did the inheritance begin? In 2004 BCE, the third dynasty of collapsed. The collapse was not sudden. For decades, the archives at Nippur, and Girsu show increasing signs of stress. Tablets record shortages, grain reserves depleted, labour forces reduced, tribute from peripheral cities delayed or withheld. The administrative apparatus continued to function, but the flow of goods slowed. Scribes recorded the shortages meticulously, tablet after tablet, documenting a system that was no longer sustainable. Then, abruptly, the tablets stop. Not all at once. Different cities fell at different times, but within a few decades, the III state disintegrated. The last dated tablet from is from the third year of King Ibi-Sin's reign. After that, silence. The silence did not last forever. Within a century, new states emerged. The city of Isin claimed to be the successor to and kings of Isin began dating their reigns and issuing inscriptions in the old style. At Larsa, at Babylon, and at Eshnunna, new dynasties arose. The cities were rebuilt, temples were restored, scribal schools reopened, the administrative system resumed. But the resumption was not identical to what came before. The language shifted. Akkadian gradually replaced Sumerian as the spoken language, though Sumerian remained the language of learning. The political structure changed. Centralized empire gave way to competing city-states. The culture evolved, but it did not reset. The new kings invoked the old kings. They rebuilt the old temples. They copied the old texts. The collapse interrupted continuity, but it did not erase it. This pattern of collapse and recovery is not unique to III. The fall of the Akkadian Empire around 2150 BCE was followed by a period of fragmentation, then by the resurgence of Sumerian city-states in the III period. The end of the early dynastic period, around 2350 BCE, was followed by the rise of Akkad. Each collapse is followed by a restoration. Each restoration references what came before. The memory survives the interruption. What allows the memory to survive? Part of the answer is institutional. Temples persisted even when palaces fell. Scribal families continued to train their children even when state patronage disappeared. The archive was not destroyed. It was preserved, copied, and transmitted. At Nippur, the scribal quarter remained active for over 1,000 years through multiple political collapses. The scribes outlasted the states they served. They preserved the texts, and the texts preserved the knowledge. But the preservation was selective. The administrative tablets from collapsed periods are fragmentary. Many archives were not maintained once the state that created them fell. The texts that survived were the ones deemed worth copying: literary compositions, legal precedents, lexical lists, ritual instructions. The texts that were pedagogical or ideologically valuable were prioritized. The survival of knowledge was not automatic, it was curated. Scribes chose what to preserve, and their choices shaped what later generations inherited. Collapse, therefore, was not the end of memory. It was a filter. Each period of disruption reduced the volume of knowledge transmitted, but it did not eliminate the tradition. The knowledge that survived was the knowledge that was written down, institutionally supported, and deemed essential. The knowledge that depended on oral transmission, personal expertise, or informal practice was more vulnerable. The collapse of a state might mean the loss of specific techniques, regional customs, or individual innovations. But the core, the language, the literary tradition, the legal framework, the religious rituals, survived because it was embedded in texts and institutions. At Babylon, during the reign of Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, scribes copied Sumerian literary texts that had been composed centuries earlier. The texts were no longer contemporary, they were classics. The language was archaic, and students had to learn it as a second language. But the texts were still authoritative. They were the foundation of scribal education. The tradition continued, but it was now explicitly retrospective. The past was the source of value. The old texts were better than new ones. The scribes were preserving a heritage, not creating a new one. The collapse of the Ur-3 state, like earlier collapses, marked a break in continuity, but not a total loss. The administrative records stopped, but the legal principles they documented were remembered. The state apparatus dissolved, but the scribal schools that had trained its administrators continued. The political order changed, but the cultural memory persisted. The collapse was an interruption, not an erasure, and each interruption was followed by an attempt to restore what had been interrupted. The kings who came after invoked the kings who came before. The temples rebuilt were the same temples. The texts copied were the old texts. The memory was maintained because the interruption was understood as deviation, not transformation. The proper state of things was how they had been. The task was restoration. But each restoration was also an interpretation. The scribes who copied old texts made choices, what to include, what to omit, how to translate archaic terms, which traditions to emphasize. The memory was not static, it evolved through transmission. The past was preserved, but it was also reconstructed. Each generation inherited a version of the past shaped by the concerns and capacities of the transmitters. The continuity was real, but it was also mediated. The knowledge that survived was the knowledge that was judged worth saving, and that judgment was made by people working within their own historical moment. If the memory survived through interruption, what did not survive? The texts do not explain. They document, they reference, they invoke, but they do not narrate origin. The administrative tablets assume the system. The legal texts reference precedent. The building inscriptions restore what was. The lexical lists transmit terminology. The astronomical records continue observation. The medical prescriptions inherit treatment. The myths describe order already functioning. The archives preserve the operation of institutions without documenting their creation. Sumerian writing is a tool of continuity, not a tool of explanation. The earliest tablets are not accounts of beginning, they are records of activity already underway. When writing begins, cities already exist. When kings are named, kingship already descends. When laws are cited, precedent is already assumed. When temples are built, foundations are already sacred. When stars are listed, constellations already have names. When scribes are trained, the lexicon is already complete. The texts enter a world already structured, and they describe that structure without explaining how it came to be. This is not an accident. It is not a gap caused by the loss of earlier records. The absence is structural. The texts do not claim to be foundational documents, they claim to be transmissions. The knowledge they preserve is described as inherited, received, passed down. The Sumerians themselves did not present their civilization as an invention, they presented it as a restoration. They were heirs to something older. The cities were rebuilt, the temples were restored, the kingship descended, the laws were remembered, the knowledge was given. The question, then, is not why the texts do not explain. The question is what the texts preserve by not explaining. The absence of origin stories is itself meaningful. It suggests that the Sumerians understood their own culture as continuous with something prior, something outside the reach of written memory. The texts do not begin the story, they continue it. Writing begins in the middle. And if writing begins in the middle, what came before? The texts do not answer. They preserve a tradition of preservation. They transmit without locating the source of transmission. They document order without narrating the creation of order. They record the functioning of a system whose origin is not recorded. The Sumerian scribes wrote within a world they inherited, and they left that inheritance documented but unexplained. The knowledge is there in the tablets, vast, intricate, operational. The cities, the laws, the rituals, the calculations, all functioning, all preserved, all transmitted. But the beginning is silent. The texts remember that something was received. They remember how it was maintained. They remember that it was passed on. But they do not remember when it was first given, or by whom, or why. The memory reaches back, tablet after tablet, king after king, temple after temple, into a past that recedes beyond the reach of the written word. The tradition is unbroken, but its origin is not recorded. The knowledge is inherited, but the inheritance has no named beginning. What the texts do not explain, they leave open. The silence is not ignorance, it is acknowledgement. The Sumerians wrote what they knew, and what they knew was that they were the inheritors of something older. They preserved that inheritance with rigour and care. They transmitted it across centuries, through collapses and restorations, through language shifts and political upheavals. They embedded it in clay, in stone, in the foundations of cities. And they left the question of ultimate origin unanswered, not because they did not care, but because the answer lay outside the domain of what writing could preserve. The tablets end where they began, in the middle of the story, preserving what was given, awaiting what comes next.